because there's also an element basically conflating Vladimir Putin and the Russian oligarchs and all that with the Russian people, and almost like condemning or guilt by association by Russian people. So you tweeted out, if ordinary Russians are responsible for the actions of their government and deserve to be collectively punished with destitution, wouldn't logic dictate that Americans are responsible for U.S. endless wars that have killed hundreds of thousands of people and sanctions starving millions more? I couldn't have said it better, but can you kind of expand on that? Because I've heard, even from people in my own life who mean well, but it's this thinking like, well, Vladimir Putin, he's only going to take it seriously and back down if his people turn against him. And the only way for his people to turn against them is for them to feel the pain. Well, you want that reversed on you based on the United States' God knows how many war crimes we've committed?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, the reality of it is that is the logic, right? The fact that you're hearing some of the commentary that just says, there's no neutral Russian. Of course there is. How about the ones who've been arrested for protesting the war? Where are our anti-war protests, right? Like again, I just referenced right now, 23 million Afghans at this very moment face starvation, and we are directly responsible for that. No one is protesting or doing anything about it. 13 million Yemenis face starvation right now as we speak in the world's worst humanitarian crisis, which has been ongoing now for 7 years, led by Saudi Arabia. But guess who's arming Saudi Arabia? The United States. So not only are we war criminals, we also arm war criminals. At what point are we responsible for any of our own actions? And the idea, in fact, that you would collectively punish the civilian population, that goes against international law entirely. So you have people who are evoking international law to say, hey, you can't invade a sovereign nation. That's what international law says, who then want to go ahead and violate international law by saying we can collectively punish an entire civilian population. Right. This selective kind of outrage, the selective application of international law is part of the reason why we are in the current situation that we're in. And that's the part that nobody ever wants to talk about. Forget the acute decisions made by the administration. If we want to talk about NATO expansion, none of that excuses an invasion of a sovereign country. War, if you are anti-war, you have to be anti-war across the board. There's an excuse for war. That's exactly why we created international institutions, to find diplomatic resolutions that fall short of war. But, the fact that we want to put pressure on this sort of hysteria around Russia, then why aren't we held responsible? We would never, ever be okay with the idea that millions of Americans should lose their livelihoods, lose their life savings, not have access to medicines, not have, face food insecurity, any of these things because of the actions of our government. And arguably, we have more of a reason to be held responsible because we are, in fact, at least we claim, to be a democratic society. And therefore, the government is a government of the people. Whereas US officials themselves say Putin is an authoritarian. Right. Russians did not vote for him, right? This is the thinking from the US. So I'm just using the discourse of US officials to say, then wouldn't we be more responsible for the actions of our government? But that's just not how it works. You don't collectively punish civilians. But this has become a policy position of the United States in its use of economic warfare. And to be clear, the only reason this doesn't happen to Americans is because no country has the power to reciprocate. The right. world economy revolves around the US dollar, and the US economy is dominant in a way where it is the sole power that can do this to any other state.
Right. And I also wanted to point out, because you're with the National Iranian Council, that our sanctions on Iran have very much harmed Iranian citizens, that the same logic has been used, that, the Iranian citizens need to be punished for Iranian leadership.
Absolutely. And actually, since you bring that up, and since we were talking about the inconsistency of criticism between Trump and Biden, Joe Biden in April of 2020 wrote a statement, or had a statement in his name at least, that specifically called on the Trump administration to ease sanctions on Iran because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because he pointed out in his own statement that despite exemptions on paper, that humanitarian goods, including medicines, were being impeded from getting into Iran. And so he called on him to do so. He's now been president for over a year. He has yet to do so himself. So at that time, of course, this is a point of criticism. Maximum pressure is a failure. Iran is expanding its nuclear program, and we are hurting innocent Iranian people in a pandemic, no less. And yet, under the Biden administration, while they are conducting negotiations, and right now we're in a place that seems like we're very close to hopefully restoring a non-proliferation deal, which everybody should welcome given the fear of nuclear war that we're currently in. Those sanctions still were never lifted. They still have not been lifted. So this use of economic sanctions has been framed by US officials as an alternative to war, where in reality, the impact that it has on civilians is akin to war. And that is warfare. It's just warfare. It's just economic warfare.
Right. And also, I'm not an expert on this, but I feel like you always got to follow the money too. So the fact that Ukrainian refugees are, open arms, as we both agree they should be, well, Ukraine, it's in the business interest of the United States, the military-industrial complex, further hurting Putin. It's in our economic interests to do that. Whereas Afghanistan, this and that, I mean, we occupied Afghanistan. We squandered trillions of dollars, but there's no real economic interest for the United States in opening our arms to Afghanistan refugees. Same thing with Somalian refugees, Yemenis refugees. Besides the just straight up racism of it all, what about that financial component?
Well, when you bring up the financial component, I think something that's important is, so you said squandered trillions of dollars. And yes, from the perspective of ordinary Americans, that money was squandered because it wasn't used to help Americans. It didn't make us more secure. It didn't provide social services, social safety nets. And not only did it not provide any of those things for us, we lack those things across the board. I mean, like, people rarely are talking about in like our mainstream media, the fact that 40 million Americans live in poverty. That is not a small number. That is a huge number. That is a large proportion of the population of the richest country in the world living in poverty. People who don't have access to medicine and healthcare. All of these things are extremely important to talk about, and how that money was used. It was squandered from our point of view, but from the point of view of the arms industry and defense contractors, it was a boon, right? It was great. Afghanistan was great. It lined a lot of pockets for a lot of people, not for a lot of people, actually, for a small minority of people. And actually, it was, I believe it was the CEO of Raytheon a few weeks back, maybe less than a month ago, who was quoted as citing the escalation between the Houthis in the UAE, as well as the potential invasion of or like conflict between Ukraine and Russia, as, this is something that's for our investors or for our bottom line is a positive sign. So when you create an industry that is profitable only based on whether or not there's war and conflict, you're probably going to get war and conflict.
Right. And my final question to you, to me, who knows how this is going to end, but the bottom line is, you're also accused as a journalist or as a scholar, Middle East expert, you're accused of whatever, being pro-Russia or Russian talking points, if you just point out that promises were made to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union for NATO not to move further eastward past reunified Germany. I mean, that's just a fact. And that was violated. That does not condone a full throttle invasion where so many people are needlessly dying. So Putin is obviously wrong to do that. And Russia is wrong to do that. But it just seems to me like there can be no nuanced discussion. The corporate media won't allow it. You never hear about NATO's expansion further east, the missiles that have been pointed at Russia. I mean, we know what happened when missiles were pointed at us, Russian missiles in Cuba. There was a momentary Cuban Missile Crisis. And if a few things went differently, you could have had all-out nuclear war. Your thoughts on it? Just seems like there's not a lot of discussion allowed, definitely in mainstream media, of why Russia feels a threat. Not that we should condone what they did, but that the United States has basically been the ringleader of breaking those NATO promises.
Yeah, well, the idea of having a nuanced discussion isn't to place blame on one side. It's to say, look, there is a problem, and typically when there's a problem, what we're trying to seek is a solution. But the only way to do that is to understand A, whoever your adversary is, and B, to look at the context. If you don't look at the historical context, if you don't actually listen to the grievances of the other side, then how do you hope to resolve a conflict? This is like basic psychology. Like, as an individual human being, if you have a conflict with another person and they're like, we're just not going to listen to anything you have to say, we're not going to listen to any reasons why we're here to begin with, but we're just going to try to solve this conflict, it's never going to happen. So it is, there's a reason why we call it media and not news, because we call every other country's media or news media, we call it, there's tags now on social media, Russian affiliated media, China state affiliated media. There's no such response in the US. For instance, VOA, Voice of America is paid by the State Department. The funding comes from the US government. It doesn't say anything about a US state affiliated media, because again, the assumption is that everything we do is truth, everything we do is right, and everything they do is wrong, and everything they do is propaganda. But in reality, if we're not even allowed to have these conversations, how is that short of propaganda? If we're not allowed to point out why we're in the situation that we're in, it's not to condone it, it's to say we have to understand it to resolve it. But if you're going to try and paint this sort of ridiculous ahistorical picture of we're the heroes and they're the bad guys, we're just going to be stuck in this cycle of conflict forever. And yeah, in the case of the US, the problem is we would feel the same way if there were, Russian troops and military bases and weapons on our borders. This is how we would feel exactly. And so to hold ourselves to a different standard, to create these double standards, is part of the reason we are in the current state of affairs. And that's why it's so vitally important to talk about that context.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.